I'd like to start with acknowledgement of country. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and their sustained custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. And we acknowledge their wisdom and their many varied contributions across the generations collectively as staff of Charles Sturt. And we pay our respects to all First Nations people, past and present. So I'm joining you today from the beautiful Biripi country. Um, and please feel free to put in the chat where you're joining us today. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so again, welcome. You will have seen, hopefully you've found all our workshops, obviously in the Teams PD event channel and also on the Supervised Assessment page in DLT. There's some links there and also a plug for what's coming up next, which is supporting students in Supervised Assessment, which is being run next Thursday. Next, please, Alice. Okay, so our workshop focus today is very much about getting ready for marking and the marking processes involved. So I'm very happy to actually be handing over to Lachlan in a second. So he will walk us through assignment portals, the rubric setup and gradebook configuration, and as well as supporting the marking teams, because we're very mindful that a lot of subjects, of course, do involve multiple markers for the same task, and a supervised assessment task that is a little bit different than the normal because of that live element. So we'll go through that, and then the second half of the workshop I'll jump back in and talk about how to support that whole marking process overall, and supporting the marking teams as well. So I'll hand over to you now, Lachlan, to do your bit in Brightspace. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole, and good morning, everybody. I hope you're all feeling energized after our session that we had last week. I know a lot of people in here were also in our first technical and operational setup session that we had around Microsoft Bookings. I will drop the link into my Padlet board there, into the chat for you. This will be my dance card, really. As Nicole said, we're going to be spending most of our time in system, looking at these tools, talking about these tools, etc. As Elise has just put there, for the session today, you're encouraged to put things into the chat. We've got a group of people in here that will attempt to respond to your questions as we can. There will be time for questions at the end, but really what we would encourage you to do, if you have a question that needs definitely needs a response, we would love it if you could pop it into the Q&A, because that will then also inform any of our FAQs and other support materials that we put together. So by all means, utilize the chat. You're welcome to do that. But to get a genuine response, as in you're going to get proper feedback and potentially a resource out of it at the end, by all means, utilize the Q&A as well. All right, so look, just a little bit of a revisit very briefly into where we got up to last Thursday, and that will then pick me up with what I'm going to be talking about today. So the first thing is that last session, we just finished towards the end talking about the new bookings page template in Brightspace. There is a page template available for staff to be able to pop in the links after they've created their booking links, etc. in MS Bookings. And I've also dropped in a little bit of information there into the Padlet board for those of you that are thinking about linking to that bookings page using the announcement tool. So that talks about quick linking at that point. Again, that's in the Padlet board for your reference. You're welcome to use that. And then lastly, I've also got a link to all of the micro clips that Beck had put together around all of the bookings process, as well as the entire recording from last Thursday's session if you weren't able to join us or you wanted to revisit that. So that was the beginning of our look at technical operational sort of setup, and we've just begun to talk about Brightspace a little bit in the context of supervised assessment. We're going to continue that thread today, and as Nicole mentioned, we're going to be looking at marking broadly, but specifically we'll be looking at assignment portals in Brightspace, setting up rubrics, marking teams, and the gradebook, and how all of those have considerations relating to supervised assessment. And a lot of this stuff I want to point out to you is actually going to be things that you're aware of or you have already in practice, and this may refresh your memory. And if I'm missing anything, other considerations, by all means put them into the chat as well. So I'm going to get the slides off the screen in a second, but the first thing I want to do, let me get on to talking about assignment portals. So this is really the main consideration that we have. Before we start looking at individual parts of Brightspace, I want you to approach this from the point of view of, before I put anything into place, I need to have a really clear idea about marking, how you want marking to happen for this activity, because ultimately that will inform all of the Brightspace setup requirements. I might be stating the obvious, but there are going to be questions in here like, how many rubrics are you going to be using for this task? And the reason we ask that about rubrics is because that will directly inform how many assignment portals you create, how many columns go into the gradebook, for example. So it may seem like a simple thing, but if you figure that part out first, it will inform all of the rest of it really in a pretty straightforward way. Next question, do I need to see the results for different parts of this assessment in different places? So what we're asking really is, if I'm using two rubrics, separating this out between, let's say in an integrated task, the submitted artifact that the student submits versus the actual discussion, interview, conversation, the observed component, if they're not happening in the same spot in terms of marking, that means we're going to have separate gradebook portals, for example, that we're going to need to be setting up. Is it a group or an individual assessment? That will affect the assignment setup. Are there different file formats? We've seen examples of people putting in things like students making video recordings and then having their supervised component to talk about those. That will affect how you set up the assignment portal. Will the students be submitting anything at all? So I'm going to throw to some examples in a minute where this will make sense. But if you think about a scenario we've had here for a long time, where we have observations like OSCEs, for example, where the students aren't actually submitting anything into the system, but we still need to be able to mark them. That informs how we set up the assignment portal. So I will go through all of this in Brightspace shortly. Some other obvious ones is Turnitin a requirement for parts of this activity. That will inform the assignment portal setup. And are there multiple attempts permitted? This is a bit of a niche requirement, but in some cases where we have students submitting multiple times, that will also have an impact on how we approach setting up rubrics, gradebook portal, the gradebook and assignment portals. All right, so the main observation or question here that I want you thinking about is usually, particularly in the context of an integrated supervised assessment, you're dealing with an artifact or a product that the students are submitting and that's getting marked, and there's the observation or the supervised component as well. We would recommend that you engage with those within the same rubric and the same portal within Brightspace. And I have a video in the Padlet that goes through exactly that process. But if you are separating them out, it's going to have an impact. So there are two options there for you to think about. One is that consolidated single rubric and single assignment portal that they're submitting into. And the other option is considering using multiple rubrics and therefore multiple portals. And the main, I guess, consideration at that point is that with supervised assessment, and if you have an integrated task, the weighting for that must be split evenly between the product, the artifact, whatever it is that you're calling it, the document, and the supervised component. So that's going to affect, obviously, how the rubric is going to be set up. All right, I think we might have a look at some examples to get you in frame here. Let's have a look. I'll get some up. I'll move this off my screen so we can start looking at Brightspace itself. All right, so the first one I've got here is a nursing subject, and I've been talking enough about OSCEs and observations that I thought it's a logical place for us to start. So if we go into the assessment area of this subject, their third assessment is an observation that they do in the workplace. They've been doing these forever. It is a form of supervised assessment. They have a single assignment portal. And if we have a look at the settings for this assignment, you'll see that the task is weighted at 50% of the total weighting. What you'll find here is that the students are submitting, they've put in here, they've changed the submission type to text, right? So it's not a file submission from the students. This is why I asked that question before. Are the students submitting anything at all? So they have in fact changed the submission type because this is an observation. If you don't need anything from the students at all, not a student number, not other information on the day, anything at all, you could also use the observed in person option. But you don't always have to leave your assignments in Brightspace as a file submission. There are other forms which are going to be of use to you, particularly because what we really want out of this is a rubric for our markers. So in this case, they've got a text submission and there is a rubric, and in fact there are 3 rubrics attached to this task. So what we find, if we go and have a look at how they mark this activity, let's say we were going to mark this particular student, we're observing them in the workplace, and at that point, the reason that they have multiple rubrics is because the students get multiple attempts at the activity. Right, so this is quite niche, but it allows me to talk about one of the main considerations of the rubric and gradebook connection in Brightspace, and that is that whatever you're scoring the rubric out of, only the most recent mark in a rubric will flow through to the overall grade. So if you're thinking that I'm going to have a rubric in here for the supervised component and a rubric in here for the submitted artifact, and I'm going to score both of them separately, it will not work because the score of only the most recently marked rubric will flow through and convert to the overall grade. So that's why I've made this point. In this context, when a student gets a first attempt and if they don't pass it, they get another attempt, it doesn't matter if we're using subsequent rubrics because actually we want the most recent one. But if you're thinking about using it for both the artifact and for the supervised component, you're only going to get a score from one of those. So I know a lot of people have spoken to me about, oh, I've got a rubric that's separate for the observation. It's like, great, but you're only going to get one of those scores that flows through to this score, and that will mess up your marking. So that's why I wanted to show you the OSCE component. The other reason I wanted to show it to you is that if we look at the actual rubric setup, so we head into Subject Admin, into Rubrics, what we'll find here, let's find the OSCE. That'll do. Let's open that one. What you'll see is that they have, in fact, we might preview this to make it a bit more friendly for us to look at. That's better. Is that they have multiple sections in this rubric with different setups, different columns, different criterion. So the first one they're calling critical safety. This might be the first part of the assessment. Only has 2 scales to choose from with their scores, and then if we go down, there is a separate section altogether that now has our standard HD through to fail setup. So you're not restricted in your rubric setups in terms of only being able to have one layout. You can have multiple. So that means for the supervised component, it's probably going to sit within a separate section of the same rubric. That seems to be the most common approach. And again, I'll go into that rubric setup when I start diving into that. But that's how they've approached it with the OSCE. Next example I wanted to show you was, we might go into Inclusive Ed. In this case, these guys have bookings for a professional consultation. It is an integrated activity. If we have a sneak peek at the subject outline, let's have a look and see what it's called. Okay, professional consultation, it's worth 40%. And if we have a peek at the rubric itself, you'll see that they've clearly separated out the different parts. We might mute that person if we can. Excellent. That they have clear labelling on the different parts for the markers. I will note that the points, however, have not been put into the scale area in here. And that's fine because you're putting those into Brightspace. You don't necessarily have to articulate the point breakdown within the subject outline tool itself. By the time we create it in Brightspace, that's where those points or the breakdown of these marks is going to happen. So some people like to put them in every scale and descriptor, but others will only have it in the actual label itself in the front part. All right, how have they approached the actual assignment portal setup? What we'll find is that they actually have different submission points for different groups doing this task. So they've actually split how the consultation is going to happen using release conditions, which is an interesting approach with your assignment portals. So it may very well be that you only want students to see certain parts of the assignment area, maybe based on bookings that they've made, maybe based on groups that they've enrolled into, but that's how they're limiting which portals are going to be used for marking. They've actually restricted the visibility of it using release conditions. I'm happy to talk to people about that outside of this session, but it's just a consideration that you don't have to make everything available to everybody. You can limit its availability and then allocate your markers and your breakdown, etc., with your rubrics, etc., based on it having limited availability to different groups of students. So that's quite an interesting approach. And if we have a look at the rubrics that they've used for the consultation, again, we'll put the preview on and have a look. You'll see that they've labelled each of the sections quite clearly. Consultations happening there. And then I'm looking for a separate section, different components. Here we go. So part 1, part 2. And that's persistent really messaging for today's presentation, is make sure, if nothing else, that your portals, your rubric, your layout for handling supervised assessment is really explicitly labelled. If there's different steps involved, stages, requirements, make sure that that is very clearly articulated in how you label any part of Brightspace for this purpose. All right, let's get into some specifics. I've showed you a couple of examples. We're going to talk about rubrics. All right. So let's jump into my training site. When you create a new rubric in Brightspace, and this is going to be a very quick refresher for you, and you're creating a new rubric, most people at the moment are now using custom points, which means you can articulate not only how many columns that you're using, so for example, HD through to fail, but you can also distinguish the point allocation for each of your criterion. But for supervised assessment, the main message that I had for you was that you can split up your rubric into different sections. And the place to do that inside the rubric tool is down the bottom here, and they call it a criteria group. So there's my first cluster or my first criteria group. I can add another one, give it a clear label. So this might be part 2, it might be called stage 2, it might just be called supervised, it might be called anything you like, but you can label it clearly. And then again, it doesn't have to be the same as the first part. It can have as few or as many columns as you need for that. So split them up so it's very clear. Some people have also been putting in details for the markers using these initial feedback areas if they want the markers to be providing different bits of information in there on the rubric as well. You can pre-populate some of that initial feedback area if you're inclined to do so. The other thing that I'll point out now when you're creating these is that you should make sure that you have populated the overall score area accurately for the task. So if you're weighting this out of 100 in your rubrics, which more and more people are doing, make sure that you've got your 5 columns, your HD through to fail, and that you've put in there obviously what the point allocation is going to look like for each of those, noting that it's or more. 84 or more gives us a HD, etc. Lastly, the options. When you're using your rubrics, we recommend that you actually hide the rubric from students until your feedback is published. They can get the rubrics from the subject outline, of course, that's the source of truth. But in terms of the scoring, the breakdown, etc., of how the marking is going to be handled for the assignment portal, if you don't hide this, it will actually mean that every time your students open up the assignment portal to try and submit their assignments, they will have to scroll through all of the rubric information as well as their academic integrity disclaimer, their generative AI disclaimer. There's a whole bunch of text and information. They could end up scrolling for 5 pages before they find the little button that says submit my assignment, browse for the file, etc. So what I'm suggesting to you is hide the rubric in Brightspace until you've finished with the marking. You may or may not want to actually hide the scores themselves so that they concentrate on which criterion scales they've achieved rather than the percentage or the number or the breakdown. It's probably a fairly even split. Some academics desperately want to hide the scores and others want it the other way. They want the students to see the numbers. That's completely up to you. Let me stop there because I can see that there's been a few comments, etc. Nicole or Elise, have we got anything that I need to jump into at that point?
There's quite a number of questions in the Q&A, Lachlan, just relating to some rubric setup and design.
Okay.
So I'm just having a look. The first, sorry, there's quite a lot. So I'm just trying to figure out where we might start. So we've got a question here. I have an artifact and a supervised assessment with different skills and tasks associated with each part and have used category and grade items in gradebook, enabling the assessment pieces to, sorry, that's not a question, that's a response. We have been explicitly advised not to have a rubric that allocates marks between artifact and oral. Both aspects, we are told, must be integrated into each criterion. A question that has never been answered is what happens if a student writes a paper worth 57%, for example, and during the oral, the marker is satisfied that it is the student's own work, but the student answers only 2 out of 5 oral questions correctly. Should that student fail? So that's more about, I think.
That is a tricky conundrum, and I think I'm going to defer to, we will engage with that particular scenario outside the session today. It sounds like there's a few bits to kind of break down there. I will say that every school seems to have a different take on how they want to approach things like rubrics, for example, around these tasks. So I'd suggest that you absolutely speak with your head of school and your AHOS learning and teaching, etc., on how specifically you're going to engage with that. As I've certainly seen a variety of approaches in that sense. Sorry, Elise, I cut you off.
No, sorry, Lachlan. Thank you for that. Matilda's wondering if the booking system could be used for student consultations, just to allow the students to get a bit used to the system before they use it for supervised assessment. Is that something that could be, can't see any reason why that wouldn't work potentially?
Look, I don't see it as an issue, and we're probably going to get a lot of people trying to use it in that way and having varying levels of success with it. What I can say officially is that right now we're sort of supporting and focusing on it used for the shared booking page for the school for supervised assessment bookings. So that's kind of where the support is at that point. I guess we can have conversations about other applications for it, but I can't sort of go on the record and say absolutely use that. But I'm happy to talk to people outside of this about other ways that we might approach it. All right.
Lachlan.
I think I'll get back into talking about gradebook columns and things and rubrics for a moment, and we will revisit some of the other questions as they are. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time pretty quickly. All right, let me just make sure I'm up to scratch on where I am. Right, statistics tool. I wanted to talk to you specifically about the rubric statistics function. Hopefully a lot of you are aware of this already, but when you create a rubric, what you'll find is that inside the rubrics area of your subject admin, you will find that there is a view statistics option in the drop-down. And at that point, inside that area, you are able to see a spread. I don't have a rubric associated with that one. Excellent. Let's find one where I do. If I pick on a subject where they've done lots and lots of assessments over time, any of these will do. Let's go for a nursing subject. That'll do. Pick on you guys and have a look at a rubric. Okay, so they've got a rubric here, view statistics. Now what you get with a rubric, or in this case several rubrics that they've used for this task, is a spread or a dashboard which gives you lots of different information which will help with your marker management and also your, I guess, keeping abreast of the marking process as it's happening live. It does not need published assessment for you to be able to get numbers around how the marking is going. So at this point, you would be able to see how many of your draft marks have gone in because the rubric has been used. So where the marking is up to. We can also open this actions button and get a spread on the HD through to fail continuum. And these guys haven't set the rubric up properly, which means the overall score section currently says something like level 3, level 4, level 2. That's not much value to me. If you've taken the time to specify HD is 85 or more, distinction is 75 or more, etc., then you get a dashboard showing you the spread of the grades as the marking is happening live. That's valuable. You also get a breakdown of how each of the individual criterion in your rubric is being scored live as the marking is happening, which is probably good for when you're reviewing the task and potentially looking at quasar and making changes, etc. But far and away, the most valuable aspect of this is that you actually can keep track of how the marking is going, both the grades for the students, their scores, which markers have marked which papers, and the date that's being referred to here is the marking timestamp, when it's marked. All of that information is available for you live as the marking is happening. So you don't have to wait for all of the marks to have been published and the whole task finished off before you can go back and start that aspect of your moderation, for example. It's incredibly valuable, and all you have to do is make sure that your rubric has been populated correctly. And I have put in a number of videos and guides about rubric setup into that Padlet board for today as well, for those of you that want to look at those. If you've gone to the trouble of setting up marking groups, and I'm going to talk about those in a little bit, you can also filter this search by those marking groups, which means if I want to see how many each of my markers, how much of their marking has been done already, I can actually go in and filter by group, and then I'll get a breakdown of how much of that marking has happened. So this tool is actually incredibly valuable for live statistics around how the marking is progressing, and I really encourage you to utilize it. It just means that your rubric needs to be set up properly in the first instance, and that you have taken the time to set up that overall score section of the rubric. That is pretty much the main reason why I would encourage people to do that. All right, let's keep going. I do have an integrated rubric sample in my subject site that I want to have a look at. So let's go in there. Okay, so there's two different ways that I've approached setting up gradebook portals here. One of them is a single portal. That means that we're engaging with the supervised component and the submitted artifact all in the same place. And if we open this up, we can see that there's a submission from a student. So if I went to mark this task, I would have the document that the students submitted here, which will populate down here in the preview, that you can mark up and annotate as we've been doing all along. But in the rubric itself, if we pop that out, you'll see that we've split the rubric into one section called product criteria. You can label it whatever you like, but essentially that is the submitted part, and we're working through the marking for that component. There's a section for marker feedback underneath. And then the second section of this rubric is clearly labelled supervised in that point. So the markers know to come back in here. So the way this is working is that the marking for the submitted component would happen at one point in time. Draft is saved. And then the supervised component, they've come in at a later point in time when they have that happening. And the marker for the supervised component is then marking up this part of the rubric. The marks get tallied together. They then flow through into this overall grade. And because it's all happening in the one rubric, this works flawlessly. So that is the main sort of recommended approach for how you approach it, like an integrated supervised assessment, is to deal with it all inside the same rubric. There are going to be exceptions to that, and people will have different reasons why they want to set up multiple submission portals and use different rubrics. That's definitely happening. So the second example that I had there, in fact, separates them out. Part 1, submit your document. There'll be a rubric for that. Part 2, submit your observation. There's a separate rubric for that. So it certainly can happen separately if you want to, but far and away the more recommended approach is to keep them all in the same area. Now look, I do realise that I'm going vastly over time here, as things are always want to happen. So what I would finish up on really is I'm going to talk very briefly about your gradebook setup. And I'll put my slides on here for a sec. And that is that when you're setting the gradebook up, if you've used multiple portals for this assessment, it's going to mean multiple columns. And if you've got more than one column for a task, I would highly recommend that you set up categories in your gradebook to cluster those columns underneath. It's going to make it a lot clearer for you, for the conveners, to be able to see how those are working together to give you the full mark for the task. So use a category to organise those columns if you are using multiple portals, multiple rubrics. Obviously other things like setting up short names, etc., to help give you the most real estate in your gradebook so you can see all of the columns. Use a short name, it'll help. And a lot of people are setting up separate comments columns for each of their tasks, particularly when they're expecting more commentary to happen against them. And it seems like that's also a consideration for supervised assessment. All right, so I'm actually, the marking team section that's on the Padlet board, I've actually got a full video that's on that board that will walk you through the process of setting up marking groups if you've never done it before. But the reason that we set up marking groups in Brightspace is so you can use that filter that I showed you before. It will allow your markers to narrow down which assignments they're looking at. It will allow you as the convener to use the rubric statistics tool to see where those markers are up to. So there's a really good reason to set up marking teams in the first instance using groups. And if you want to know how to do it, there's a video here for you in the Padlet board. All right, Nicole, I'm going to stop sharing there and hand back to you because I know that I've definitely done my dash in terms of time for today.
Thanks, Lachlan. That's amazing what you've shown us there. I think it's all about knowing that these options are available, and definitely something that we know there's different ways of doing different things. In every scenario, a lot of these assessment tasks, of course, set up very different, and we can't possibly cover everything, like the massive marking teams, the integrated, standalone, and so on. I also note there's quite a few comments in the chat and in the Q&A, and for the purpose of time, I'm hoping that we'll pick these up. Hopefully there'll be a bit of time at the end, but we have noted them, of course. Also mindful that some of you might go, oh, well, my supervised component isn't worth the same as the artifact and so on, and it was set up at the beginning of this semester. I think moving forward, the aim is to have that 50-50 breakdown next semester. And this semester is, we were working very quickly at that stage. Beginning of semester, it seems like forever ago. So do revisit that and adapt and adjust and from your learnings from this semester as well. So what I'll do is I'll get into the getting ready for marking. So just by way of background too, so I'm an educational designer now, but I've been working for a long time as a sessional lecturer and marker for the School of Business. And so I kind of know my head a little bit around the marking, and I was trying to unpack all this. And I did do some interactive orals for a consumer behaviour subject not long ago. So I kind of understand a little bit of where you guys are situated as well. It's not all that different, but there's some things where emphasis is definitely a little bit shifted, especially when you are working in those larger groups. And I saw how many groups are in some of those subjects you shared just then, Lachlan. But basically, if you want to break it down, and this is where we can situate some of those decisions that Lachlan's talked about already this morning, we've got that before, during, and after that supervised assessment piece. So I'm talking about that bit where you are talking and engaging live with the students. So there's an example of how you sit prepared, and it's really all about emphasizing that calibration with the marking team. But even if you are marking by yourself, still really working out what you're looking for and hopefully getting some advice as to how to calibrate your marks, meaning that the marks you allocate, the grade you allocate, represent the student's level of knowledge, understanding as matched to the marking criteria. So what I like about this word, how they phrased is that calibration involved rubric walkthroughs, joint review of sample recordings, mindful that we might not have those yet though, live practice and daily debriefs, and running a mid-session assessment calibration and watching for that drift analysis. I know when you mark a lot of papers in the past myself, I've find that I'm drifting. I'm either getting crankier, harder, depending if I'm tired, or you go, are you getting more generous because you're in a good mood? No, that you can't have that happen, right? That's not accurate. That's not fair. That's not good practice. So it's good to keep checking that. So this is probably the most important part of this whole process is before the nutting everything out. Like Lachlan's already explained, there's lots of those little decisions to make and talk through ideally with your marking team. So good idea to have that kickoff marking team meeting. So of course you've got to work out, is this an integrated task or standalone? That'll have, again, impact on the marking rubric setup and the whole approach. The marker profile and availability. Now, I have picked up myself some marking work in the past where I've come in cold and I've just gone, here, mark this. I don't really know that, I haven't taught the subject myself. I'm coming in cold. I really need to get my head around what this assessment is about, what's the subject about, what's the assessment about. And so sometimes you'll have markers come in and they're not that familiar with the content. Sometimes you yourself might be a very experienced marker who's done this before. So it's a good idea to work out who's who in the zoo, so to speak, and look for those opportunities to buddy up people. Maybe one person who's more experienced with one less, so they can, there's fresh eyes for the experienced marker to refer to, and of course there's experienced eyes for the new marker to refer to. So you have to talk about how you're going to approach marking, how the setup, the resources that are available. How are you going to practice? Are you going to want to practice? I think it's a really good idea because talking is different from writing comments, right? And perhaps creating some examples of these kinds of professional discussions or Q&As that you're doing with the student, the supervised part. Of course, if you don't do the exact one, do a slightly different version of it, then that can also be created as a student resource. So you're both practicing. The content discussed might be slightly different, but at least you can then also share that with the student and they can see what they can expect. And often putting a marker in the position of a student in these sort of examples, it's also, nice to see for the students, yes, okay, this is what they're experiencing as well. A key thing here is, like I said before, unpacking that rubric and what's really required. And also remember that importance of note taking. You know, what are we going to be recording, not just live recording, but also on paper. So for moderation purposes, especially, that's really, really important. And again, those logistics, the bright space, the booking system, and then any moderation or QA requirements that might be involved. And the key aim here is calibration and consensus. And investing all this time unpacking the rubric and what it means, what you're looking for, how you're going to grade these students is really important at this stage, because it'll save you time. I know myself as a marker, I've been frustrated with sort of vague marking rubrics, and I go, oh, what does this really mean? How do I mark this? How do I measure this? So, and the other thing is, if the marking rubric, when you're in this live supervised assessment situation, when it's in your head, you know what to look for, then it helps you marking in situ at the same time. You don't have to go back at the end of a long day to recalibrate and see where you're at. So that's kind of that piece there. So, and of course, with moderation, it is important to check your school requirements. So if you look at the Q&A section in the Supervised Assessment tab, you'll see that the Supervised Assessment does not create additional moderation obligations. It's usually it's the most heavily weighted task that is required to be moderated. And the evidence used for moderation includes those recordings and completed rubrics and the marking notes and assessment artifacts as highlighted here. And Lachlan, did you want to say something about the management of the recordings?
Look, I just put a comment in the chat. We haven't talked about them sort of extensively at this point, beyond the fact that because the meetings are happening from Microsoft Bookings, the meetings are happening in Teams, which means the recordings are being made in Teams, and the way that Teams handles those recordings is that the individual marker who has been assigned via the bookings process will be the custodian of the recording. So it ends up in their OneDrive folder. So their CSU account folder for recordings. I think we've put some of the detail of that into the Padlet from last week, and certainly the next session that Beck and I run will be talking more about it. But beyond the fact that the marker has access to those recordings, and DIT has sort of an administrator that has sort of centralized access to everything, essentially, there isn't kind of a share solution beyond that in place at the moment. So what I expect will happen is that there will be discussions in school around what they want to do with the recordings, and that may vary from school to school. If that means they're saying to people, well, we should copy them somewhere else or do something with them. But we haven't engaged with that beyond that point at the moment. It's going into the individual markers folder.
Okay, thanks, Lachlan. I'll just skip back to hit this too, that just a reminder too. So like I said, it's not additional moderation, but your school may also have or faculty may have specific requirements too. For example, in BJBS, they do require that all assessment tasks weighted 20% or more are subject to pre-marking discussion and the provision of a marking guide and the consensus on the 1 and 2 sample items before marking commences if they are available, and as well as that post-marking brief. So again, we do defer to ask you to refer to your school specific requirements in relation to that, and also in relation to workload. I just read a comment then about workload, and that's obviously a really big issue that we are mindful of. Again, though, I do want to emphasize that if you are part of that discussion initially to get your head around the rubric, that will ultimately save time, and having everyone on the same page with how to approach these supervised assessments and marking, like any other marking as well, saves time at the other end, where you don't have to then fiddle and adjust marks at the other end. So that's really what I wanted to emphasize, that consistency. So because everyone's different, you have different, it seems more subjective. So it feels more subjective when you're marking supervised, but when you have a really good rubric to go from, and you've unpacked that rubric, it'll make things easier. So I've just come up with some ideas of how you might start that discussion. And even I understand that these things feel like they take a lot of time, but you can actually save time again by helping describe what you're looking for. And I've actually had a bit of a play with AI to help me to get me started, and that might be something that you want to look at yourself. It can create an annotated rubric which clearly describes and drills down into what is required at each grade level. So you might start off with a fairly general question, but you might need an extra question, something that drills a little bit deeper, so you can differentiate a pass response from a credit response, or a credit from distinction, which is often, for me personally, when marking one of the more difficult areas. And then you might also look at some questions. So you generate some standard questions, or questions that can then also easily be adapted. So obviously you don't want to ask each student the exact same questions, because they might talk to each other. And so then there's that academic integrity issue there as well. And of course, if you do want to provide students some of these resources, don't use the exact questions you're going to ask in the supervised component, because then they can just chuck it in AI and rote learn it, and you're still not really understanding how well they understand the material or address the learning outcomes or the criteria trying to assess. So I just wanted to share with you with this just some ideas. I chucked in an already used rubric from a report previously, and I asked it to come up with some suggestions for the marking rubric in terms of the supervised component. And what I liked about this is that it talked about student responses in relation to probes. So that's an example there. I'm very mindful of the time, so I'm going to whiz through these fairly quickly, but of course these slides will be made available for you to have a look at. I really like what if and why not questions, because you can vary them fairly easily. And of course, the response to what if or why not questions, the what if makes the student think, oh, what if? So you're adding an extra variable in there, so they have to use some more critical thinking, not just rote learning things, content. And the why not is, again, requires a defense, right? The student has to justify why they generate a certain suggestion, recommendation, or took a certain approach. So like I said, they can be readily customized. So, what if sample size or distribution change? This is for a psych subject. What if one procedural step were removed? Now, again, this is AI. This is just a starting point. I'm not across this content or this topic, so hopefully the psychologists aren't too horrified by what AI has given us here, but I wanted to show you how it can help you to have those conversations, have a think about really what's going on. And this example here, I find particularly, thought this was particularly useful when you are using an integrated task and you're assessing the same marking criteria for the artifact as for the interactive piece. Okay, so basically you might get a great, brilliantly written report that's HD level. So you can see that in Brightspace. The other marker might have marked that already and it's a HD, and you go, okay, well, here's some questions I might ask to see if that really, the student does really know and understand the content at that HD level. So again, just a starting point to get you talking about how to approach these things. And in the process of doing all this, you get a really much better understanding about the assessment task and the rubric. So you're creating some resources to help, but you're also thinking about really drilling down in that space of the descriptors in the marking rubric. So during the supervised assessment, and I do acknowledge that this can be tricky, but it is in terms of timing, but I think it's really important to have some calibration meetings during the session, so it's not too late, all right, to work out, especially when you are working with a team with people who may not have done this very often, even if it means perhaps it's too difficult to get the whole team together, maybe still keep communicating, chatting to each other, schedule them into, block out spots in your booking calendar so you know that you can talk as a team about what's been going on, and try and moderate 3 or 4 supervised assessments to really sense check and calibrate. Again, that is to save time at the other end. Anyone who's done moderation and's come up with lots of deviation in marking approaches and marks being awarded, that's a real pain to correct at the other end. If you do it before it gets bigger and bigger, I think that'll save a lot of time down the track. So it's a good idea to also discuss and keep track of pain points. You might find that in your assessment, oh, a lot of students struggled with this particular question or this particular topic. What did you do? Work out how to approach this so there is that consistency. And then, of course, remember to take those notes as well and document everything. Having moderated myself, having had stuff moderated before, I always like to talk about those those assessments that I'm not quite sure of, because that's a really good conversation point to see where things are at, but also then that'll help you. You don't have to talk about it again later. Okay, so you get that affirmation. Yeah, actually that was a solid distinction, not it was better than a credit. So okay, and then afterwards, take a deep breath. Of course, you need to adhere to those moderation requirements if it was being moderated. It's a good time to debrief. What went well, what did not go so well, how are you going to do differently, what you're going to do differently next time. And as a subject convener, you do need to, of course, fill out your quasar as well. And there's a whole section in quasar, and I've got a link at the end of these slides, a really good guide about what's required for moderation. And it's quite useful to have a look through that, because you can see the different options and how to approach moderation and the requirements and what sort of things you're going to be asked about in quasar. Thank you, Lachlan. I just saw your thing about the don't forget to breathe. Maybe I shouldn't have had that second coffee, right? Okay, we'll keep going. Okay, so just some tips. Connect early and do have that buddy system if you can, even if, you might, ideally, you do have those marking team meetings with the whole team, but it's even nice to just have a buddy and just check in. Hey, how are you going? Just on the Teams, just quick, just so it feels like, yeah, I had a good one. You just help you debrief. I mean, we talk quite a lot about the student experience in these, but your experience as academics, marking and your well-being, of course, is really important too, right? Personally, I did 30 interactive oral assessments. I did them over 2 days. It was tiring. I was a bit like that dog, I think, at the end. But at the same time, I really enjoyed it, because I got to meet my students. It was like, oh, who am I seeing next? Before were just names, but now I was talking to them, and I found that personally rewarding. But also definitely scheduling breaks and having the break times in front of you, so you know when you're going to have a break. Just little things like that. So having that buddy system, and I wish I had one, because I would have been able to go, oh, I just had a really good one. It was really fun, or that was a challenging one. How would you have handled this? So just keeping connected, so you're not doing this alone, and then also look after your own well-being that way as well. It is important to decide how you will communicate. So you might want to have your own Teams channel. You might have a shared OneDrive folder where you share the resources, the marking resources and so on. Do schedule those regular check-ins. That co-creation I was talking about the scripts, the prompts, the rubric, unpacking the rubrics and so on, that does save time and reduces that uncertainty. Okay. And then, of course, think about that setup. Like I said, remember to plan clear timings and include breaks between assessments to prevent marker fatigue. It's a real thing, and accommodate demands of active listening. And like I said, I was quite happy to have marked 30 assessments that were worth 30% in 2 days. That's pretty good going for me, because I find that, yeah, you do get the marker fatigue. So again, having the supervised part, I did really, really enjoy it. So this is it in a snapshot. We've covered a lot in the meeting today, and I am mindful of the time, that we don't have a lot of time left for questions now, but I do believe, I think overall with the supervised assessment, it seems like a lot, but once you've done it once, it is so much easier as well. And I think it's so important that, having these conversations and working together with our colleagues and drawing on people's different expertise in this is really valuable. And it can actually be fun. But, there is the prep work. When you do the prep work, and make things easier, just like with any marking long reports in marking teams and moderating them is not easy either. So the systems and the processes aren't really all that different. and hopefully you will get to enjoy meeting your students face to face and talking to them, and they're not just a number and a name on the screen in your online meetings or in your grade book. Okay, so what's next? So on this Thursday, we are going to look more closely at how we can support students in supervised assessment. Mindful that some students find this a little bit scary to begin with. But again, we are here to help them develop these skills, to speak to people, to think on the spot, and to also give them the opportunity to show off what they've learned. That's definitely what I used, that phrase. I can't wait to meet you, show off what you've learned, how hard you've been working, having that really positive approach to this, hopefully putting some of their minds at ease there as well. And again, emphasizing that developing these skills, this is a perfect time to learn how to speak, have a professional dialogue, because that's what you'll be doing when you get out to the workplace. So if you're skilled up for that, that's also puts you a step ahead. Okay, and I think that might be my last slide. Yep. So we will provide these slides with all the resources and that they will become available, and the Padlet links, they've already been shared. And of course, don't forget, there's lots of resources in the DLT website on supervised assessment. The Q&A is particularly useful because that does get updated regularly with all the questions that we receive. So keep them coming and put them in the Q&A here before you duck out today. And of course, there's the Brightspace page as well on assessment in the Teaching Academy. So I'll stop sharing now. There you go. Now I can breathe, right?
Nice work. Look, I'll stop the recording there as well. I know we're hanging around for a few minutes.